So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are today in the world. Welcome to day 3 of the 7th annual ReNAPRI Stakeholders Conference. This day is designed for our partners to share information and to enable our stakeholders to discuss key issues that affect the agriculture development and food systems landscape in Africa. Thanks to all of you who have been with us since the official opening of this conference. We value your support and hope our content, our research content, meets your expectations. Let me apologize in advance for any technical issues that may occur today. We understand that a number of African countries are struggling with power outages at the moment due to heavy rains, particularly in the Southern African region. So bear with us if we have any technical hitches during the sessions today. So today we have 2 exciting webinars, which are just as exciting as the webinars that we've had over the last 2 days. The first webinar is a joint session organized by the Eastern Africa Grain Council, EAGC, and the Regional Network of Agricultural Policy Research Institutes, ReNAPRI, who are the hosts of this conference. This webinar is titled Recovery of Regional Grain Trade Chains in Sub-Saharan Africa Beyond the COVID-19 Pandemic. A very interesting topic on grain trade chains in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I'm sure you are all excited to be a part of this conversation today. The second webinar is organized by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Security Policy Research, Capacity and Influence, also known as PRCI, hosted at Michigan State University in the USA. PRCI, as some of you may know, supports ReNAPRI in a number of our strategic areas of work. And so we're grateful to PRCI for taking time to organize this session, which will start immediately after the first session. The PRCI session is scheduled for 14:45 Central African time or 15:45 East African time. So please stay tuned for these 2 exciting sessions, which will then see us closing the 7th annual ReNAPRI Stakeholders Conference completely. Next year, when we have our next conference, we hope we will have more partners participating in this side session of the conference. So to begin with, it would be good for you to note that the Eastern Africa Grain Council and ReNAPRI signed an MOU this year to ensure that we link research with practice, particularly in the private sector. And you all know that an MOU is only as good as its operationalization. And so we've decided that in order to operationalize our partnership, we will undertake joint activities from time to time to ensure that our research work as ReNAPRI is well informed by the voices of those who are directly impacted by the policies that ReNAPRI's research informs. So this first session will be moderated by the Regional Programs Coordinator from the East Africa Grain Council. I hope Janet is here with us. Her name is Janet Ngombalu. She will walk us through the session, which is got two parts. One part is that we will receive some key presentations from some experts in the continent, and then we will have a panel discussion. So Janet, I'm just trying to confirm with colleagues, is Janet here with us?
Yes, Nalishebo, I'm here.
Good. So Janet, Regional Program Coordinator for the East African Grain Council, Eastern Africa Grain Council, I beg your pardon. I would like to hand over to you. And on this note, to just thank the Eastern Africa Grain Council for partnering with ReNAPRI to support agriculture in the continent. Welcome, Janet.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nalishebo. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this dialogue. We are excited to have you on board. And so before we start, I'll just make a quick remark on behalf of EAGC and to thank ReNAPRI for the partnership and the MOU that we have done together so that we support research in the continent. And I think we are off to a good start with this webinar, and we'll be having more going forward. For those who don't know the East Africa Grain Council, we are in 10 countries in Eastern and Southern Africa region, supporting structured trade in grain, and research and policy is one of our perspective. I know my colleague, Kim Mhando, will be presenting on what we are doing in the sector on in terms of COVID and other related subjects, so I won't go much about that. So now I would like us to start off the sessions with some presentations from some of our partners. So, okay, I was using what was on the screen, but let me open my notes. So we can start on the global perspective with Dr. Holger Matthey from FAO. Kindly give us the global perspective on the COVID, on the grain value chain. Welcome.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I would like to share my screen to show a few slides here. Okay, hope that works. Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and the honor to start off the discussion with a few remarks on the global perspective. In my presentation here, I would like to cover these topics here: the trade impact of the pandemic, policy responses, how do we assess the current agri-food market situation on a global scale, share some analysis that we do on the medium-term risks, and share a few concluding remarks. So is that actually in the way? So, due to the measures implemented to contain the spread of COVID-19, disruptions were reported at all stages of the food supply chain. So, first of all, due to the widespread lockdowns, we had shortages in agricultural labor. That's built also into the transport sector, impeding farmers' access to input and output markets. We had lower capacity utilization of processing facilities, especially in the meat industry, and the rules and regulations that were put in place also led to international distribution and logistics disruptions. Now, governments had to address both the supply and the demand side disruptions through policy measures. And there were a number of them put in place with mainly the objective to keep domestic markets supplied. So on the exporter side, trade restrictions, especially export restrictions, were put in place by countries in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, that threatened, the supply of the global market. So on the other hand, countries that depend on imports, they tried to ensure their supply of their domestic markets by lowering import barriers, technical barriers to trade. But most of these measures, they're probably going to last till the end of the year, if they're even still in place. And the third pillar that we identified is that countries gave support to their domestic markets, to their producers, to the supply chains and in the wider sense, and also tried to help vulnerable populations by sealing prices, making sure, you know, nobody can exploit certain shortages or bottlenecks by raising prices, and overall keeping the market well supplied and access to food is assured. So the problem with this was that most of these were uncoordinated ad hoc measures, right? Every country tried to do something quickly, different approaches were applied. So the global community was worried that we're heading for a situation not unlike what we had in 2007-8, which led where uncoordinated policy measures made an already bad situation even worse. That had to be avoided at all costs, right? So the global community did get together and coordinated their efforts in various bodies like the G20, the APEC, the African community, and everybody sort of agreed that we have to avoid export and import restrictions. Product needs to keep flowing across borders, across continents. Then also the international organizations like FAO and other bodies made efforts to keep market transparency very high, so not to avoid, not to leave anybody sort of in the dark about the situation that may lead to panic reactions, not again unlike as we had, especially in the rice market in 2007-8. So systems like the Agricultural Market Information System made great efforts to really have the information out and available for everyone. And then also modern technology was applied to sort of alleviate the situation, especially in trade, which was caused by the lack of personal interaction due to the COVID rules. So technology stepped up and allowed facilitation of trade. Now, how did that play out? We conclude it worked very well. I mean, if you look at the current market situation, and it's here characterized by the stock-to-use ratio for rice and wheat on a global scale, you can see we're nowhere near where we were during the global food crisis. The market is well supplied at the moment. Of course, for stocks, China is always a big factor, as you see here on wheat. Looking forward into the current season for cereals, the overall outlook is again very positive. So this slide I borrowed from our market monitoring colleagues. That's why they call about a cut. A cut means a cut compared to their previous month forecast, right? They give an annual, the AMIS people give an annual, a monthly update. So they lowered it a little bit, but nevertheless, we're heading for an all-time high for coarse grains driven by the EU, the Ukraine, the US, for wheat driven by Ukraine and Argentina. So especially since early in the season, we had higher prices, farmers were encouraged to expand their plantings. And since the crop production wasn't that much impeded by the COVID restrictions, things could progress there very well. So barring any weather shocks, of course, we're heading, as I said, for a very strong harvest globally, as you see here on the tail. And also the utilization does not seem to be restricted in any major way. That's also reflected in the prices, is summarized here as the FAO Food Price Index, which is an aggregate of all major global reference prices of major food commodities. And you see they were heading down early on during the pandemic, but now they are recovering. That also has to do sort of with how the dollar performs, of course, because they're denominated in dollars. Local and national prices may, of course, deviate from that, depending how well integrated the markets are or on any exchange rate shifts, of course. But globally, we're not heading again for any price spike or anything. So far, everything seems it is very resilient. Now, how do we assess the crisis in the medium term? That, of course, depends a lot on all the assumptions that you make. So we used our medium-term modeling capabilities to do a very rough estimate of how the crisis affects agriculture, and try to compare sort of what could have been without it versus what we see now the impact is. And if you remember the first slide, so all the different channels of transmission of the crisis into the markets, so we tried to reflect them in the model, so that we lowered the GDP in 2021, and then we had what we call an L-shaped recovery. So we didn't sort of have a big rebound. So it stayed actually, even for the medium term, below what could have been without the crisis. The inflation, early on, we had sort of almost deflation. Inflation was lowered. Energy costs were lowered, even though that wasn't entirely COVID related, right? Remember, there was the big dispute early on between Russia and Saudi Arabia that brought down the oil price. Biofuel demand got down as a result of that, and as a result of the travel restrictions everywhere. Trade costs, already mentioned, they were higher, so we reflected that. Labor costs were higher because, especially in processing facilities, we reflected that, and also how the IMF saw the change in exchange rate. So putting all these shocks into a global agriculture model gave us these deviations from our pre-COVID baseline here. And you have on the left panel the crop production, on the right panel the livestock production. And you see the changes overall are small, right? So this is 0.5%, this is 1.5%. So crops, of course, are in the ground, so nothing much in 20, a little bit in 21. But with an L-shaped recovery, of course, you have a lasting impact here. The regions, as you see, they differ a little bit, but by and large, the changes are small. Naturally, they're higher on the livestock side because the impact is bigger on the supply side as well as on the demand side, because the impact of the income restrictions is stronger on higher value goods because they have higher income elasticities. So the impact is about 1% higher here. Similar picture if you disaggregate this by individual crops. There are some trade-offs between oil seeds and grains, which lead to that temporary increase in oil seeds. That has to do with the trade and restriction and more domestic, which favors more domestic processing. Looking at the demand side, yes, the calorie availability, sort of our proxy for sort of nutrition, does go down everywhere, and it does go down the most in sub-Saharan Africa because there the food expenditure share and disposable income is the highest, and the income elasticities are the highest. So the poorest regions are hit the hardest. And this is the average. And if you look at the distribution, of course, on the tail end, this is cause for great concern of increased undernourishment, and you have witnessed that and know more about this than we do, but the model actually confirms it. So as the last one here, the trade impact on the left-hand side, all the net exporting regions, on the right-hand side, the net importing regions. Naturally, trade, if supply and demand goes down, trade has to go down as well. So the big traders are hit the hardest, North America, South America, and also the importers. Of course, if you consume less, you import less as well. So from all of that, the consensus, at least in the unit at FAO here, is that the global agri-food trade and value chains have proven quite resilient. Severe shocks were avoided. The international community came together and avoided to take very disruptive policy measures. So restrictions were generally short-lived. So we're not anywhere near the implications that we saw in 2007-8, because immediately when we started in the spring, people were heading, you know, into that direction with sort of the narrative, and people always wanted to know from us, what is the new food crisis? Is it a new food crisis? No, it's not a new food crisis. It's very well under control on a global level. But going forward, we have to be, of course, aware that we're currently witnessing a resurgence, especially in Europe here. Now we're getting a second lockdown now all over Europe. In North America, we're having a second wave. So this whole thing, this pandemic is by no means over, and more measures are probably expected and affecting economic activity. So governments and all market participants will be very challenged by this situation, and we have to stick together to, you know, as a global community to overcome it. And hopefully the vaccination will be coming soon and providing relief. But that's again not sure. So other things still have to be kept in the planning. So with that, I conclude and I return to the moderator. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Holger. I hope I pronounced your name well. We appreciate the presentation and your remarks from FAO in the presentation, noting that we are not in a very bad picture in terms of food crisis. We're not going back to 2008, but supply and demand of commodity has been affected. Therefore, trade is somehow affected. And we are glad that FAO is also providing market transparency through market information systems, which will support us to make decisions moving forward. So colleagues, if any of you has question for Holger, please, I can give 2 people as we set up the next presentation. If anyone has a question, let me know. You can put up your hand. You can write on the chat, or you can just unmute your mic and speak. If anyone has a question for, let me see in the chat. All right, so I don't see any questions for now, but if you have, kindly let us know. You can unmute and speak directly. We'll come back through during another question and answer session, but for now, I'll invite Ferdi Meyer from ReNAPRI to make the next presentation, please. Okay, welcome.
Thank you very much, Janet. Colleagues, good afternoon. Can I just get a confirmation? Do you all see my screen?
We're good.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. And it's a privilege to do a short presentation on the Southern African continent part, following up on Holger. And thanks again, Holger, for your presentation. And all the great work and collaboration over so many years that we as a ReNAPRI network could have with you at the FAO, and all the great insights and linking up with the global models. So I'll be going through some of those on the ground impacts that we picked up, and the picture is really mixed. So we have a mixed evidence of impacts of COVID-19 on food trade. And the picture that I show here is actually the border post for Beitbridge, and where we experienced significant bottlenecks. And that was a really a big characteristic. We've been having bottlenecks for quite some time, but the congestion just picked up a lot, and that was mainly due to you know, the skeleton staff, restrictions, social distancing implications that had a big impact on the efficiency of our border post. What was, however, interesting to note is that even at this Beitbridge border post, and this is a key border post between South Africa and Zimbabwe to deliver food, there was a fast lane, and this fast lane was already created in January. That was actually before the lockdown period, and Zambia was rapidly running out of grain. Zimbabwe, sorry, was rapidly running out of grain, and we were actually transporting a big volume of grain into the Zimbabwean market. And there were exceptions to these bottlenecks. So we saw long lines. The next picture shows you these lines that we saw in Uganda. We have pictures of 10-kilometer long lines and mainly related to lockdown regulations. Those were the specific, that was the biggest impact. Furthermore, in our surveys and our analyses, private sector reported also challenges in terms of liquidity, labor shortages, logistical bottlenecks, access, lack of access to extension services and access to inputs. So all these supply chains, Holger also referred to those, we had some restrictions on those. The interesting part, however, is if we just look at trade stats, these are monthly exports of South African maize exports on a monthly basis. And what we did in this graph is we just compared 2017, 18, 19, and 20. And if you look at that, the orange bars give you total exports. The blue bar give you South African exports into the region. And you can actually note that in 2020, right in this COVID time lockdown period, our exports, our volume of exports into the region were actually much higher than in previous years. Now, that's obviously South Africa had a very good crop. We had export parity, very competitive prices, and we moved a lot of stock into the region. And even into the global market, total exports reaching about 500,000 tons a month that we were shipping out. So in the South African case, although we had a lot of challenges in the ports, again, due to lockdown regulations, social distancing, all of the above, we still managed to get grain and grain trade flowing relatively effectively, and actually got a lot of the data, a lot of the grain out. If we then just take a step back, and I think this is important for the overall discussion, to understand the broader context of grain in the region or grain trade in the region, then it becomes very clear that the last season was really a blessing for this Southern African continent in terms of a very good harvest. So if you look at that the bar chart, these orange bars, that's the 2020 crop. So if you would look at South Africa with a total crop, this is the second largest crop in the history of South Africa. That's 2020. In other words, the crop that we just harvested in June, July, almost 16 million tons. But if you also look at Zambia, they've had a very good crop, about in excess of 3 million tons. Mozambique had a good crop, about 2.2 million tons. Zambia requires about 2.5 million tons, 2.4 million tons. So actually surplus stock available for exports into DRC, Zimbabwe, Northern Zimbabwe, Harare. Mozambique, still dependent on South Africa in the south, but in the central regions, Mozambique is self-sufficient. And again, the bigger impact on the trade flow and grain trade flow in Mozambique is not COVID. Those were there was a political instability in the country, which displaced a lot of poor households. And that was a much bigger disruption than what we've seen from COVID. Tanzania, also good crop. If you look, almost at 5.5 million tons, feeding a lot into Kenya, where we know that's a net importing market for maize. But still, even Kenya currently is looking at a better crop than previous years. So overall, if we take this total picture into consideration, the traditional bottlenecks remain the largest stumbling block for regional trade to expand. And these include, and we've discussed these over the last 2-3 days, ad hoc government interventions, export bans, levies imposed, poor infrastructure, lack of transparent data on stock levels, supply and demand. And those are challenges that have been in existence for a number of years. And we can see that also in the little diamonds where we can see price levels. So overall, price levels are actually lower than what they've been in years where we've had extreme shortages. Or Holger, if you think back 2007-8 comparison, we are not nearly close to those levels. And just to make the point here, we had monthly prices spiking towards the end of 2019, 2020 in Zimbabwe, Zambia mainly, and pulling a lot of grain into Zimbabwe and South Africa. But look at these prices now. They're much, much, much lower during the COVID pandemic. And I think this has been a blessing in disguise for the region. Long-term fundamentals still play a critical role. And this is from a strategic perspective, just understanding South African markets still remains a very important reference point for white maize in the region. It's a futures market, the largest futures market in the world in terms of white maize trading. And there you can see our local prices trading very consistently at export parity levels with significant volumes of exports going out of the country. And in years where we have a drought, our prices run up to import parity. That's what we had in 2015-16, where we had significant droughts in this region. Now, what's very interesting is that Zambia has also been following a rapid expansion in production over the last decade. If we just look at an index of maize, wheat, and soybean, their hectares planted, we saw the rapid increase in maize hectares planted between 2005 and 2010. Big driver for this increase, obviously, global prices, bigger investments, larger farms, more area becoming available, growth in the medium scale farming sector. But look at these trends in recent years. The area has been relatively stable. Then we saw the sharp increase in wheat production. And now recently, in the last 2-3 years, a very sharp increase in soybean hectares and production levels. So in all of these three crops, Zambia has actually expanded, moving from a net importer to a net exporting position. So if we just compare the difference between world prices in the blue bar and orange prices in the, or Zambian prices in the orange bar, so the difference between world and Zambia prices is now narrowing and much, much smaller than what it used to be 10 years ago. So in other words, Zambia is starting to trade more in line with global prices as their surpluses are building. But the real challenge comes in, and this is a bit of a busy graph, but I just wanted to illustrate to you, and this is, it's not a snapshot what the current prices are in exact terms, but the principle of this graph illustrates actually the biggest challenge that countries like Zambia, where we actually switched from imports, a net importer to a net exporter, what these countries are facing. And that's to get the grain, get the surpluses either consumed in the domestic market in terms of processing, or actually exporting, getting this product out of the country. And as we've referred to, as the challenge is really remaining these very high transportation costs. And a lot of transaction costs or inefficiencies across the borders. So if we just look at this graph, and I'll do a short explanation of this. On the x-axis, we've got yields, metric tons per hectare. Now look at this market. If you just at about a ton a hectare, if I would take current area under production in Zambia, let's say it's about 1.5, 1.6 million hectares of maize. You need about 1 ton per hectare to satisfy domestic human consumption. If we would then add feed, seed, and breweries, you would get to about 1.3 tons. If we would add the food reserve agency, we need about 1.5 tons in terms of yields. multiplied by the area. So that would give us about a 2.4 million ton crop. So what's the price support? It's about $190 where the FRA would buy or would typically come in, step in as a last reserve of buying maize. So this orange line gives us an indication of maize prices. What is the next option? Would be Zimbabwe. So Zimbabwe could take about 600, 700,000 tons, even more, depending on how much South Africa sends from the south. But the price difference is about $30 to get it into Harare, and sometimes even more. So that would drop the Zambian price, the farmer's price, to $160 per ton. The next step would be Malawi, a little bit further away. That would drop the price to $150 a ton. In other words, coming down to lower export parity levels. And what is the current break even for these farmers? With a yield of 2 tons, they would need $150. Now, look at the next alternative. That would be Beira port into the world market. We need to get, by that time, we have Zimbabwe's shortfall met, Malawi's market is filled, DRC is filled. So Zambia would have to go out with their maize. And that would drop the price to $98 per ton at the farm gate, which is significantly below the break-even price for a Zambian farmer. So this step just shows us the price wall that we a lot of times see now in countries like Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, Tanzania, that are all starting to produce surpluses. They've expanded their area under production, and now we really need to get agro-processing going or reducing transaction costs and getting exports far more efficient. Now, the good news is we've actually seen significant investment in agro-processing in some of these countries. This is an example of soybeans. So just eyeballing this graph, look at the rapid increase in soya meal exports in the 2017-18 season. Now, this is due to big investments in the Zambian processing or crushing of soybeans. And we've seen the same for Malawi, and we've seen the same in Mozambique. South Africa also actually expanded their crushing capacity from very little, about 300,000 tons, to 2.1 million tons. So there's a rapid increase in these processing facilities. But then we need to look at the further chain. In other words, the interlinkages. Do we have enough feed demand, or must this product be exported? And again, the efficiency and the of exporting cross-border trade comes into play. Last figure just showing the South African growth in soybean market in terms of the outlook. Holger talked about the outlook. And here we can see our projection is that soybean prices will eventually start trading at export parity levels. And you can see the rapid increase in the area and production of soybeans, and which is eventually will lead soybean prices to either trade at export parity or at the derived price of the oil and the cake. And on the right-hand side, you can see sufficient space in the crushing or processing facilities. And that would, our projections that were only by 2026, 27, we'll be filling up all of our processing facilities. So again, this has an implication for surplus meal coming out of Zambia. So Zambia was actually looking for a market. It could, and there is some meal and beans coming into South Africa from Zambia, but in a short period of time, 3-4 years from now, our local market in South Africa will also be filled. And so there are a lot of dynamics playing out currently in the southern part of the continent. And again, it brings it back to the old principles of more efficient regional trade, cross-border. We really need to look at infrastructure and lowering transaction costs and more efficient ports to get the surplus production out, or doing a lot more of the local processing. Thank you very much, and I'm passing back to the chair.
All right, thank you very much, Professor. We appreciate the presentation on the Southern African front. to note the issues that were brought out by COVID-19, the issue of congestion at the various borders, but also we appreciate the fact that there was movement of food, at least across the border, despite the COVID. South Africa was even able to export much more than usual to other countries and to the continent. So that is also a good indicator, and we appreciate that. We also note the growth of the Zambian grain market, and that now Zambia is almost at the same price parity with the international prices, which is a good thing. We'll be hearing more on Zambia from our panelists later, and also the crop that we are all expecting in the region. Continue posting your questions in the question and answer session tab. I had seen one question from Humphrey about why Professor Ferdi did not focus on Uganda, but just note that his question was focusing on Southern Africa, including Tanzania. So next we'll be looking again at the Eastern Africa region, which is highly related with South Africa and our trading partners. Then we'll also go ahead and look at West Africa. So because of the linkage between Southern Africa and Eastern Africa, I would like to request Kim Mhando from the Eastern Africa Grain Council to please make our presentation, and then we'll hear from West Africa going forward. We'll come back and take questions for Dr. Holger as well after this session. Thank you. Kim?
Just a moment, I'm finishing to set it up. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. You can type in your questions.
Is that just a moment?
Professor Ferdi, if you're still there, maybe you can take one question on what's accounting for the sharp increase of area planted of soybean in Zambia. Is it policy or is it market driven? Professor Ferdi, you can take that question. Professor, are you still on? I think you're on mute.
I can continue. If you can see my
just
screen.
hold on, Kim.
Okay.
Kim, hold on. Professor Meyer is muted.
Can you hear me now?
Oh yeah, that's better.
Okay,
yes.
Great. Okay, just quickly on the soybean area expansion, and I think we have great experts online who can help us in more detail on it. But our understanding is obviously the expansion both in smallholders as well as commercial producers on the soybean area, and it is largely also a demand pull impact where we've seen this this investment in processing capacity, which has really opened up the opportunity for better prices, and local demand is rapidly expanded, and therefore we saw the producers just moving into the space. And we've also seen a lot less government intervention in the soybean space at that time when we saw the expansion. So whereas private sector investments have been more careful in the maize as industry with a significant amount of government intervention and uncertainties when markets are closed, export bans, etc., buying of the FRA, the soybean market has been less influenced by government, and has made it very attractive for private sector to move. But there also recently we've seen more engagement by government, etc. So it's interesting to see which direction that market will go. But the bottom line is Zambia is already starting to produce surpluses, or has surpluses even for the last 2-3 years in soybeans, and they will have to get it out of the country to really see more growth coming.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. I think for the other question, I've seen Philip asking about production in Kenya. We will hear that from Kim, and then we can see if your question will be answered. We'll come back to the others. Kim, kindly go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just take a few minutes to go through what has been the impact of COVID on Eastern Africa, and noting that a number of the issues have perhaps already been somewhat touched on by colleagues. So, but to kickstart, okay, I won't go too much into about EAGC, but just give an overview of how East Africa grain trade dynamics operate, and then go into the impact of the pandemic on grain trade in the region. And then after that, we'll look at what we have been doing to support grain trade, and then finalize with some recommendations. So I think
before you continue, I would like the ReNAPRI team kindly assist Jacob Mwale to get on board. Kindly get in touch with him. Go ahead, Kim.
Yes, so by way of a very quick introduction, EAGC is a nonprofit organization established about 14 years ago. Our main role really is to facilitate structured grain trade, and we operate in 10 countries in Eastern Africa, which those which you can see on the screen. And we have multiple things we do around that, from trade facilitation, market information, capacity building, and also policy advocacy. Going straight into intra EAGC or intra East Africa trade, we note that there's significant, interdependence between various countries, and these are really born out of, first of all, having a very diverse kind of crop calendars, whereby, as you can see from the table at the bottom, almost every month of the year we have a harvest in one country or the other, and this creates opportunities for trade. But also we have very different agroecologies, which gives each country different comparative advantages in producing growing commodities, which again creates an opportunity for trade. And you can see this with the graph on the side, whereby you can see the tall lines or bar charts on the far right, which is regional demand and supply for maize, an example. You can see the region is quite self-sufficient, although the individual country dynamics may be quite different. So this regional sufficiency is what we use to really ride on to promote grain trade, and not just any grain trade, but grain trade which is organized, structured, inclusive, and actually benefits the entire value chain. In terms of how we relate with the rest of the world, we are, as a region, we are main net importers for maize, not really maize. Maize is more or less self-sufficient, but mostly wheat and rice. And with these, we tend to import from various parts of the world. Like wheat is usually from the Black Sea countries and Latin America. Rice is from Asia, but Asia is also a major export destination for pulses. And you see countries like Kenya, Tanzania, Ethiopia, amongst the major exporters of pulses in the region, and indeed in the world. So this shows that we have quite a lot of integration between not just ourselves, but also with the rest of the world. And whatever happens out there tends to have impacts on what happens in East Africa, as was highlighted earlier. This is just to illustrate some of the trade flows, which I've spoken about. I wouldn't go into much detail on that. Now, coming to the pandemic itself, what it has meant to our sector. I'll look at it in three main ways. We're starting, first of all, with cross-border trade, noting the fact that there's a lot of interdependency, as I mentioned earlier, between countries for grain commodities. So cross-border trade was the first area which was really, really affected because the first thing health experts advised was, of course, movement restrictions and social distancing to curb the spread. And in East Africa, truck drivers were identified as an initial key vector amongst through which the disease was spreading in the region. So we saw a lot of restrictions at borders, and with this we saw a subsequent big decline in grain trade. And in here we're looking particularly at maize, which is a dominant traded commodity in the region. We saw about a 7% decline in trade at the beginning of the year vis-a-vis at the end of the year. Now, as much as this decline is seasonal, because you usually see trade decline at the beginning of the year, because Kenya, the main importer, usually has ample stocks at around that time. But even then, a 70% decline is way more than is expected on average. So that was mostly attributed also to some of the COVID-19 impacts. So these disruptions at the border included issues around the COVID tests, which led to a lot of disputes between countries. We also saw delays of up to 3 weeks, and I think we'll hear more about that later. And you can even see on the side, we have a truck which was at Namanga, which had been at the border for several weeks. And you can see the maize already starting to rot and germinate on the truck. So this consignment, of course, if it was heading to a miller in Kenya from Tanzania, will no longer be fit for purpose in that respect. We saw also, because of these challenges, about a 30% increase in transport costs because of longer transit times, because of the border delays, but also because in order to avoid such quality deterioration, the exporters have to maybe containerize their cargo, which reduces the load weight they can transport at any given point in time. So it means the unit cost for transporting a consignment of maize or any grain was increasing. Right. So these are some of the issues which came out because of the disruptions to cross-border trade. When you look at access to inputs, there was a significant also impact in this area, particularly in Kenya. At the time when the pandemic was starting, Kenya was getting into the planting season, and that meant that a lot of farmers were unable to get inputs through their conventional channels. Of course, you look at other countries like Uganda and Tanzania, the impact was much less reduced because their main planting season had already taken place before the pandemic got onto these shores. So that there was a bit of a disruption on access to inputs, although it was different between countries. One of the other impacts as well was on farm laborers. So we also had done a study with our partners, AGRA, in Ethiopia and Rwanda, and we did see that one of the most affected segments was farm laborers. The reason is because with relatively strict movement, restrictions on movement, farmers or farm laborers cannot get to their place of work. And even amongst the farmers, there's a lot of fear about interaction between them and people who are not from their community. So there was a loss of employment and a loss of productivity also associated with that. Again, going to trade and processors, there's also a big impact here, although the impact was also different between in different countries. So in a country like Kenya, which is highly dependent on imports to complement the domestic production, we did see a huge decline in the operating capacity of some of the grain processors. Some of them reported declines of up to 50% in the capacity they usually utilize, but in most cases, it was also down to around 30%. The reasons for this were twofold. First of all, there was a supply issues because of the cross-border trade, but also demand issues because with some of these millers depend a lot also on institutional clients rather than just the retail clients. So here you're looking at schools, you're looking at hotels, you're looking at restaurants and so on and so forth. And with the lockdowns, we saw that a lot of this whole segment of it pretty much disappeared overnight. So if for those millers who were depending a lot on orders from institutional clients, they obviously had a big decline in business. And with that, we saw some of the financial constraints to keep their businesses operational. Now, in this area, countries took different measures. Some I think in Uganda, there was a move towards helping businesses reduce their cost of credit. So there are moratoriums granted and executive orders pretty much granted to banks to cut down or put on hold credit repayments. In countries like Ethiopia, businesses were actually not allowed to fire anybody from their staff because of because of the cash flow issues. They were only perhaps permitted to maybe not pay people on time, and also getting a bit of financial support from the government, although it was very limited. In terms of what we have been doing as EAGC, we have been engaging in policy advocacy to support and improve the border situations to get goods moving. And here we worked closely with colleagues in the East Africa Business Council. We also had a lot of work to do around trade facilitation, whereby now our platforms such as GSOCO are becoming more useful to support trade linkages, and also through the G-Hubs to facilitate access to inputs. As you can see there, we were able to connect farmers in Uasin Gishu in Kenya to get a delivery of fertilizer from Yara. And then also support members to restructure some of their credit lines with banks. Essential services travel, although this was mostly for Kenya. And yeah, those are mostly some of the things we were able to do. And lastly, in terms of recommendations, and maybe this will go into what the panelists will also discuss, we were really looking at harmonized and more coordinated policy making at EAC for more consistency and clarity. A lot of the issues we saw because each country was doing different things. For example, up to this day, Tanzanian trucks or vehicles cannot go into Rwanda because of COVID-19 restrictions. So even to do business, and I believe we have colleagues in this meeting whom we are working with to facilitate trade, they will tell you that to send a sample of grain from Tanzania to Rwanda, there is demand right now. There's demand, a lot of demand in Rwanda for maize, and there's a lot of stocks available in Tanzania. But to get a sample to move to the buyer in Rwanda from a seller in Tanzania, it takes up to a week just to move a sample because there's no vehicle going there directly. Courier services are highly costly for such types of arrangements. So it becomes the process becomes a lot more cumbersome. So even the process of doing trade is much more difficult. So what we are looking for is a more coordinated process for policies at the region, and then also maintaining open borders, and again adopting structured trading systems, which we believe will facilitate trade and create a lot of efficiency in the way business is happening. Lastly, I did not prepare much of a slide for outlook for the sector, but what we can say is that what we are seeing already indicators for this quarter and maybe going into Q1 for next year is that the market for most of the staple food grains, particularly maize, will be relatively stable, other factors remaining constant. We're expecting a relatively good harvest in Kenya, despite all these challenges, and we are lucky that the desert locusts were not as impactful as we had expected. So the harvest is ongoing and it's looking relatively stable. We're also expecting earlier in next year harvests in Uganda and Rwanda, which are also looking relatively favorable. So we expect, with all factors being considered, the market not be as volatile as it had been earlier in the year when the COVID-19 restrictions were just being introduced. So with that, I go back to the chair and thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kim, for the presentation and the engagement on what East Africa Grain Council has done during the COVID, for presenting to us the crop calendar and the different agroecological zone in the East Africa region. Then the issues of cross-border trade, what happened during the COVID-19 and what's continuing to happen, and that how it has impacted on trade facilitation, on grain processing, on access to inputs, and what that could mean for the region. But we also note the good harvest that we're expecting in the region, and also the current crop that we still have in Tanzania, which has not managed to move out, but we are still supporting in trade. So thank you also for the recommendations, but we'll still come back to that. So as Dr. Andrew from Agyei from ReNAPRI, as you set up your presentation on the West Africa region to see what's happening in that part of the continent and also what we can do, please continue to set up as we take maybe one question. So Dr. Andrew, you can set up. Yeah.
Can the other person stop sharing?
Okay. Yeah, please set up. Dr. Holger, are you still there? There is one question for you here.
I'm here.
There was someone who is wondering, because of the situation on the grain and cereals, also reflected in horticulture and livestock situation. Do you see the same happening of not having a crisis like the 2018 in the grain sector? Do you see the same happening in horticulture and livestock product situation? Is that the same?
I think it's a little bit different because especially the fruits and vegetables, I mean, they're much more heterogeneous. So the situation and the market structure is different than the more homogeneous crops like maize and wheat. So we haven't done explicit research. It's more sort of my subjective impression and what I've seen. I think that locally consumed fruits and vegetables are expected to benefit, actually, because we see a trend towards more locally consumed produce. Right? And as we have also seen, these transport restrictions that simply prevented to bring in fresh produce, that favors the local producers. But then on the other hand, for that, where you need lots and lots of mostly migrant workers, they have a problem because the migrant workers couldn't come to the fields. So these producers encounter losses. Even though there was a demand, the supply was hampered. On the other hand, exotic, or what in temperate climate regions are considered exotic fruits that mainly came in the cargo holds of airliners, they of course suffered tremendously by the collapse of the airline industry. So we cannot go those mangoes and everything into the main markets in Europe or in Northern America. Are suffering, or they need to restructure, they need to find new ways of shipping. So you have to look case by case.
Okay.
On the livestock industry, yes. So there's the labor intensive processing, you know, the meat cutting line. First, a lot of migrant workers that couldn't come, or it's very the social distancing is a big problem. Lots of them were closed because they were super spreaders there. And so that again put farmers under pressure, because especially in tightly scheduled industrialized systems, if your contract meat cutter closes down, you cannot keep your hogs because they just grow and then they don't fit the facility anymore. Same with on those very integrated markets. If one link in the chain has a problem, the whole chain is likely to collapse, and we have seen farmers that encountered problems there. But adaptations are made, and the problems were mostly locally. I'm not talking a global crisis here, but locally, and that meant losses for individual farmers. So I think adaptations have to be made there, but they're underway. But it may take time, and things here and there will still be problematic in the future.
All right. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I see also Charlene wanted to speak to the same question. Charlene, Annette, you wanted to speak on horticulture and livestock?
No, I apologize. I was just copying other participants' questions from another platform. So,
okay. Thank you so much. Okay, over to you, Dr. Andrew. Please tell us about West Africa.
Thank you very much, Chair. And this is going to be brief. I make one point, I ask a question, and also discuss a lesson that we can learn. My point is, we cannot build resilience during a pandemic for the same pandemic, but we can prepare for future pandemics in the long term. So how do we build this resilience in terms of the long-term perspective? 3, what lessons can we learn from sterling West African countries which are doing well in the production of rice? And I pick my discussion from where Kim somehow ended by suggesting that for any country to trade with the other, you must have a product. Given that rice is an important food security crop in West Africa, one would have expected that local production would be meeting the demand. But that is not the case. For every 1 bag of rice consumed in West Africa, half is imported from either Asia or elsewhere in the world. The value chain is mostly dominated by smallholders, local producers, and there is lack of technology. We see finance constraints, coordination is an issue, and it's become a bit difficult to attract private sector players, especially for the missing middle. And when I talk of the missing middle, we are talking about processing, haulage, and an attempt to add value. Post 2008 food crisis, many African governments, including those in West Africa, made attempts to reform or improve the rice value chains. After several years, we've seen that some of these countries have done well, others are improving, but not as much as one would expect. The question is, how did COVID-19 affect these value chains? And does the type of value chain actor or actors matter? In my opinion, both smallholders or the local unupgraded chains were affected as much as those which have upgraded in terms of technology and skill, etc. We also see a bit of labor supply challenges and, more importantly, uncertainties, which is hampering production. I also make the point here that financial institutions' reluctance to lend to basically all firms, including farms, has been exacerbated, and that is also affecting the rice sector. But we cannot blame COVID-19 for everything. There were already underlying challenges before COVID-19 came, and one of them is typically the rain-fed situation which we have. Production volumes we know are susceptible to drought, and that is critical. And as I mentioned earlier, there are challenges with well-developed processing and handling and distribution infrastructure. Of course, the coming on stream of commodity exchange infrastructure may be addressing some of these. Value chain governance and institutional innovations to address coordination and marketing is also generally lacking, and it is a subject matter which we need to pay attention to. So with COVID-19 in the mix, I would isolate one impact on the rice value chain in West Africa. And this is what I will call the lack of enough products on the market, causing households to panic and making panic buying, which has resulted in price rises. So the question is, how do we ensure that in future, if there is another pandemic, there will be enough rice within the sub-region and households will not panic and buy more than they need? You know that prices are sticky downwards, and whenever they move up, it is difficult to bring them down. A case in point is Ghana, where a bag of rice was 180 cedis pre-COVID-19. During the height of the COVID, in March and April, prices went up to about 230 cedis. The additional 50 cedis has not entirely gone away, and households must bear that price. I present 3 case studies to show that the different trajectories taken by different countries in the sub-region has resulted in different outcomes, and there are lessons to be learned from there. So let's begin with Nigeria. And Nigeria is important because it constitutes nearly half of the population in the sub-region. And mind you, food security is an issue there, and nourishment is affected by or about 15.7 million people in that country are affected by undernourishment. And the big concern here is that is growing at nearly 19%. Average rice consumption is also quite high, about 28 kilograms per person. We've also seen the same country producing rice of an average of 3.7 million tons per annum, and this is growing at 10%. Among the top 20 producers of rice, I think Nigeria is there, but that doesn't mean that they are producing enough to meet the demand of the country. So what did the country do? They imposed steep taxes on the imported grains. And the objective here was to encourage local production and prevent unfair competition from products coming from elsewhere. And you might know that the production cost of West African farms are about 30% higher than those in Asia. And that has critical implications for the consumer. They also blocked food importers who requested foreign exchange to import rice. And ultimately, in August 2019, we remember that Nigeria's borders were closed to other West African countries. And the main objective was to prevent the influx of rice, which were coming through Benin. And these were not rice being produced by just Benin, but rice imported from elsewhere and then sent into the country. So some tariffs and border closures were implemented. After this, the central government also guaranteed minimum price for the rice that people produce. Input supply was also supported, farm loans. There were also some tax exemptions for plants which wanted to process the rice. We've seen these activities help to promote the production of the crop. They are also encouraging large companies to come into the rice production platform and begin to bring some kind of large-scale activities into the space. And we've seen Dangote and others making the moves. Foreign players like Olam are also coming on board. So Nigeria is making some attempt to ensure that all that happens. Now, if you go to Mali, which is a landlocked country, it has a long-standing tradition of producing rice. But what is remarkable about Mali is that between 2010 and now, they have more than doubled what they produce. So what did they do? They provided subsidies for farmers and they concentrated strictly on the rice sector. They also encouraged or provided avenues for a group of farmers to buy machinery, and that has promoted the growth of the sector. So mechanization was important. And one other important thing is that if you check Mali's budget today, they are spending nearly 15% of it on the agricultural sector, as recommended by the AU, which this is more than 10% of what is required. Let us look at what Ghanaians are doing. There is an anchor or flagship program called the Planting for Food and Jobs. It concentrates on several crops. There is input subsidy, market access, and extension. They are also rehabilitating some of their irrigation dams. These activities are generally not countrywide. They pick efficiency centers and concentrate on them. The outcome on the Ghanaian rice industry is that, yes, there have been some growth, but not as compared with Mali or Nigeria. So if you take a look at this graph, Nigeria, which took a double-edged sword approach in terms of promoting the production of the crop, you see that they are really moving their production up. If you think about Mali, which I discussed earlier, they are more than doubling their output. And when you think about the Ghanaian case, where they concentrated on more crops, they seem not to be doing as well as the two other case studies. So there are some lessons to be learned. And I end with these concluding thoughts. In the context of constrained capital, I think that it might be good for West African countries, which are in dire need of rice supply or any other crop that they believe they are really in need of, to concentrate on that crop and ensure that that value chain works better. Of course, there is benefit in spreading your portfolio because it might help you control some of the risks. But the fact that populations are growing, urbanization is on the rise, and people now like to consume rice more often, it might be a good thing to think about promoting the production of rice in places where it works. Because if you take a place like Niger, they should be dependent on other places like Ghana, Burkina Faso, or Mali for their rice supply. But if these countries are not producing enough, then there is a gap in the supply, and attention should be paid to it. Mali has also taught us that sticking to some of the recommendations of the AU, i.e., making sure that a significant proportion of the budget is spent on agriculture, can turn things around for a challenged value chain. We believe that there is more investment needed, but these investments should be targeted with the aim of improving efficiency. Remember that if an Asian produces a unit of rice for 3 cedis 50 pesos, the West African person is going to do that for 5 cedis. Or if I put it in dollars, if the Asians do it for 3 cedis $50, I mean $3.5, the West African would do that for $5. It means that there are efficiency gaps, and we need to concentrate on that. I think we also need to create a careful balance between protectionism and efficiency improvement. Of course, Nigeria had a case, but by closing her borders to other West African countries, it was not just the rice value chains which were affected, they also affected other processes, including those who export drinks and other products. So there should be a balance between protectionism and efficiency improvement. I think that if you look at the Malian case, where they did not protect their market, they have still been able to get to where they wanted to. So we think that as countries in West Africa think about improving their own capacity to produce rice, they should lower the barriers created for other West African trade. After all, the African Continental Free Trade Area, that is what it emphasizes. We also need to promote the consumption of local rice. And what this has done in Ghana is that media houses picked up the campaign. And in fact, last year, before Christmas, all the local rice produced had been picked up, and it was difficult to get some to buy. And what this is doing is that it is now encouraging other private sector participants to come into the value chain and produce what the sub-region needs. Mind you, if the entire SSA imports 3 bags of rice, 2 of them come into West Africa. Therefore, there is the need to think about improving the production sector of this particular crop. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew, for taking us through what's going on in West Africa, the issue of the rice production in Nigeria, and the changes that are happening with the local production and all that, and also reminding us about the underlying issues that were still there even before COVID-19 and what we should be doing about them. And I know time is not on our side and would like to go to our panelists. I don't know if, I know there are quite a number of questions for that session. I don't know if our colleagues, the presenters who have done a very good job, are still available and can access some of the, can answer some of the questions directly on the panel, that we can take a few as we transition to the next. So to finish off, I can finish off with Dr. Holger before he goes. And there was one question for you remaining. Let me find it. Yeah, no, this is something else.
I provided a written answer to one, so maybe that's
okay. All right, I think
that the one on the high value products, I posted a written answer in the panel here.
That's good. That's good.
So yeah, please, for participants, if you can refer to that.
There was one about Tanzania. If Tanzania allows cross-border to continue unrestricted, I think that one you can take, Professor, and also the information on Zambia. What's driving the increase of crushing capacity of most processing companies? I don't think that's a question. I think it's a contribution from your team, Mukadawira. She says that the market has been driven due to the crushing capacity of processing company, and they're from grain trade as millers. There are quite a number for Kim. Kim, can you take some of them? See if you can respond directly to some of them.
Okay.
Then, let us know what you'd like. If you're on the chat, you can pick one or two questions to respond as we transition to the next.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think I answered to Charles about the movement restrictions. From where we sit, we have noted mostly between Tanzania and currently Tanzania and Rwanda. I think between the other countries, it's there are no real restrictions apart from just complying with the COVID measures. There's a comment also, I think, about the recommendations that they're not necessarily new. Yes, they're not necessarily new. What we had put them there and mentioned that we just want to have a basis against which we can start the discussion in the panel, where we can perhaps take a deeper dive into what exactly we can be doing to address these issues, and particularly looking at it more futuristically beyond the pandemic and how we can, like Dr. Andrew said, prepare for future shocks. There's also a question about exchange rates. In our place as EAGC, I don't think we have really looked much at exchange rates and how that has happened. But I think Charlene would like to answer that. She can address it together with the other researchers. So I think those are the ones for me. Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Janet,
yeah.
Janet, just a logistical issue.
Yeah.
Charlene is only sharing questions from the audience. She's only putting on the platform. And then our presenters are able to respond to those questions in real time on the platform. So we just request our presenters, when they see some questions, if they could just directly answer them, so that in the interest of time, and then we can move on to the next, to the panel discussion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Ari. Thank you, Dr. Nalishebo, for that. So we would like to move on to our panelists. Thank you very much, our presenters. If we were in a workshop, we would have clapped for you, but in the interest of COVID-19, I think we just will appreciate you for your inputs, and we'll share the presentations later. So we'd like to go now to the panel discussion. Our panelist today is Jacob Mwale, Executive Director at ZAMACE. I hope he's here with us. We have Yusuf, Director of RoadTainers Limited, and we have Protase, Echessah. So I'll have a few questions for each one of you, but as to start us off, would like to hear from each one of you, starting with Jacob Mwale. What is the current situation in grain trade, especially for you, ZAMACE? What do you see is affecting your sector, your trade, as we move forward? Dr. Jacob Mwale, please. Jacob, are you there?
Jacob is muted. Jacob, I think you are muted. Okay. Whoa. I think we've lost Jacob.
Hello, is this working now?
Yes, yes, we can hear you. We can hear you. Please turn off your camera and speak.
All right. This technology. Okay, am I clear now?
Yes, you are.
Yeah.
That's sure. Can I proceed?
Yes,
thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the organizers, ReNAPRI, ECGA, my colleagues who've walked this journey all this time together. Thank you that we the same platform today. I've been listening to the various presentations. Yes, the information given on Zambia is quite spot on. You asked me what is happening right now, generally, especially as regards the supply of the major staple grain, staple, though like related to what is happening across the borders, in that the difference between the local prices, which are around $163, $65, compared to across Zambezi, especially down in Zimbabwe, where it's above 300, and up north, DRC, where the demand is also high, the prices are slightly higher than that. That has been driven more to the restricted exports that have been put in place in terms of assuring the local supply and the stability in terms of the price, which has paid off in terms of ensuring the consumer gets a good price. But of course, it will have some killing effect as we go forward in the next season, in that the farmer gets a return which is very close to his break-even point, and then he tends to decide whether to plant maize or plant soya. And that relates to some of the pointers raised by the professor who presented from South Africa much earlier. I'll pause for now at that point. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jacob, for that. Yusuf, Pastor, on the logistics and transportation, we've had quite a number of challenges around that. Could you please introduce and speak to that? Yusuf?
Yeah, hello, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Everyone hear me?
Yes, please.
Hello, yeah. Yeah, okay, around the transport area, most of the issues are arising around delays coming up at the border, which is causing a huge increase in costs. As the picture Kimani had shown earlier, trucks are sitting there for, I've got data here, we've got trucks that are sitting for 8 to 10 days just due to border delays. This is both going to Uganda and coming. Our primary route is through Uganda, transit way. And basically that creates a massive increase in cost, because an average trip return loaded should be 8 days. But I'm spending 8 days to 10 days sitting stationary. So naturally sales go down, costs stay the same, drivers' mileages increases because they need money to survive over there at the border. And that's basically creating the whole issue of logistics delay. Fundamentally, it's that. I mean, there's also issue of port and all that, but rising from Corona. But the main issue is currently the border point is still very slow, especially bringing cargo from Uganda to here, which is the predominant work we actually do with EAGC. EAGC, sorry. So basically, just fundamentally it's around delays that are causing increase in costs currently.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Yusuf, shortly. Protase Echessah, the Senior Program Officer, Regional Trade at AGRA. What is your experience and what is AGRA doing around the COVID situation? Protase?
Thanks a lot, Janet. And thanks a lot for the speakers who made presentations. I think they made very good points. And one thing that comes out extremely clear is that we seem to have similar issues cutting across the continent in terms of the impact of the COVID-19 situation. Now, I think as has been spoken about by several speakers, that there is nothing new that we are really learning other than what COVID has done is to aggravate what we have already been experiencing in the past. Issues around lack of data for decision making, issues around relying on rain-fed agriculture for crop production, issues around trade restrictions and so forth. All these come to affect the way the value chain or supply chains in the region perform. Now, I think one of the things that we have learned from this presentation is that we need to rethink about how to improve the resilience of our systems, farming systems, so to speak. And it is pointing out very clearly that issues around data generation is really important. We have also seen that we need to improve the capacity of our systems for the data generation and sharing of that information for decision making. And we at AGRA, one of the things that we are doing already that respond to that in terms of addressing some of these concerns is the issues, the interventions we are beginning to have around strengthening systems, especially in terms of regional food balance sheet, initiatives that we are currently either already implementing or in the pipeline for that purpose. We are also looking at strengthening farmers' access to structured markets, so to speak, because I think one of the issues that has come out very clearly about the impact is that the informal systems have been affected much more, and within these informal systems, including informal cross-border trade, has created a lot of problems, and therefore to improve some kind of resilience around these issues, we need to support structured output markets. I think one of the issues that also came up from the speakers is how production services have been affected, especially extension services to farmers and so forth. And we must start thinking about how do we, for example, leverage digital platforms and infrastructure in terms of providing advisory services to farmers. We also need to think about how we can deploy technology, especially in the activities of supply chains. I think that is going to be very, very critical in terms of imparting resilience in the work that we are doing. One of the things that did not come out from all the presentation, I think we forgot about the consumers and the impact this has had around consumers, because most of the speakers, I think, didn't look at this, and this is you cannot trade, you cannot produce if there's you are not looking at who is going, where the demand, the final demand is coming from. And the issue around the consumption is really important. And one of the things I think in terms of the impact of COVID has been, the loss of livelihoods. And in terms of planning forward, I think we need to think about, safeness, because even most of our small scale producers are occasionally net food importers, and therefore issues around safeness becomes important. And of course, around production, I think moving forward, we need to look at how we can improve access to smallholder farmers' access to inputs and technologies so that we can improve the production and productivity of key players within our food production systems. Over to you, Janet, for now.
Okay, thank you, Protase, for bringing those insights on production, on the farmers, who sometimes we tend to forget. But yeah, like you pointed out, we didn't speak to the consumers. I'll come back to Jacob Mwale to tell us. But before that, Yusuf, could you kindly share some light on what's happening at the border point? Is testing being done actually at the border post, or do we allow for testing in another area so that you don't have to do it at the border? How many days are we being allowed before we cross with the same test certificate? And also how that is affecting the grain commodity that you're on transit with. How does that affect the grain or the food production? I mean, the food transportation. Yusuf?
Okay. Yeah, well, basically, look, if you're going this way, currently there's border testing, but you have to pay for the border testing, which is around 7,000 shillings per test. And that's only valid for 2 weeks. Now, with the current average turnaround, that basically means roughly you end up doing a test per trip. Near makes no difference. And the main issue is there's just the queue, even if you have tests from Mombasa, which we do, and we get private testing done here, it still takes 4 days in a line. The queues of 10 kilometers that one person had mentioned earlier is actually on the low side. It's longer often. It's reached 20 plus at many times. I think that 10-kilometer queue is an old story, right? And even coming back from Uganda, like we said, testing is there, but it's very expensive. It's not realistic, $70 plus for testing, or $65, I think, I'm not sure. But it's about 7,000 Kenya shillings for testing. And that's basically creating the issue. And then what happens is, as a result, my turnarounds drop, my effective capacity drops by almost half. So people are saying there are no trucks available. In reality, the trucks are there. It's just everybody's operating at 50% capacity. And the rates have gone up, and that's, again, as a gentleman mentioned, affecting the consumers. The costs are going up.
Okay, what about the quality of the food? Do you see any changes on the quality of what you're transporting? Have there been rejections?
Well, not more than normal, no, because we're usually very cautious. You see something like that picture you showed of the beans germinating. That's
germinating,
the grain, germinating. That's mainly because of water penetration. A lot of that happens with water penetration. But if you take necessary precautions and cover your cargo effectively, it's not really an issue per se. But main thing is the cost at the end of the day is what goes up. The grain quality, if you transport it well, it's fine. Most of it is in containers anyway.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. And do you then transfer the cost to the transporter, to the owner of the cargo? Is there an increase in cargo transportation costs because of the COVID, therefore? Or
there's been a marginal increase in rates. And a lot of it, a majority of the cost ends up being bared by the transporter at the end of the day. Because you see, my trip turnarounds has gone down to half, but my rate difference is 10% on the high side.
Yeah.
So a lot of it ends up getting bared by the transporter. Again, this was the idea, was we're waiting it out and we're hoping by end of the year things will stabilize. But now end of the year seems like we're in a second wave. So it's almost like we're going back to square one again. So now effectively rates will have to go up because we can't afford to sustain this. Any longer.
Okay, so the cost now for that will have to be either taken up by the processor, and in line with that, then it's taken up by the consumer. So we expect prices of food, therefore, to rise. And that's why we come back to you, Jacob Mwale, as a trader, and the issues of transportation and costs. And talking of consumers within Zambia, within South Africa, what do you say about that and the cost of food, knowing that transportation may be a challenge, knowing that there could be other challenges because of lockdowns, and knowing that we now may have the second wave of COVID? Do you see also high food increase for the consumers? Jacob.
It seems his connection is frozen.
All right. Okay, we'll come back to Jacob about that. So Protase, even having had the various challenges we've had from the sector, what are some of the lessons, the positive lessons we have learned out of this COVID, and how we can manage the grain sector and the regional trade? Any positive?
Thank you very much. What we tend to, like my other colleague had mentioned.
Okay, we lost Jacob again.
Hi, Janet.
Yes, Jacob, we lost you at some point. Have you been? Are you back, Jacob?
Hello. I hope I'm clear. I'm back. Can I proceed?
Yes, please.
All right, thank you. Yeah, some of the things I think have been alluded to. One of the major things that we need to consider going forward is to improve the statistics in the country, to build confidence in the consumer and avoid panic acquisition of commodities, and also information is improved on the availability, and that would help. That would also free movement of commodities. I think too.
Yeah. So Janet, I think we can ask Jacob to just hold on until we see his connection get better. You can ask another question. We can move on.
Yeah. Okay, then over back to you, Protase. What are the positives and what are we learning from the pandemic with regional trade, and what can we do going forward?
Janet, I think what we can say at this point in time is that, you know, for every catastrophe, I think there are some lessons to be learned. And for this particular, and I think the big lesson that is coming out from this is that the managers of our food systems need to rethink about how we do business. And more importantly, this pandemic, I think, gives us an opportunity for us to be able to, as countries, to redraft or rethink our strategies around the food systems, which I think some countries are beginning to do that moving forward. One of the things that, the positive thing that also come out from this pandemic is that I think intra-regional trade is extremely important, especially when different countries began feeling the problems of outsourcing from the international market. This should be able to give us an opportunity to relook at what the continental free trade area offers and work to remove any of these obstacles that obstruct cross-border trade moving forward. But more importantly is, I think governments also need to look at how they manage the country's food security situations. And in this regard, I think the functionality of the strategic grain reserve within these countries becomes extremely important. And I look at this pandemic as one of the source of opportunity for countries to rethink and try to improve the functionality of their strategic grain reserve. But obviously, we also need to start working together as countries. We need, as different partners in this space, the issues around coalition building in terms of looking at how we coordinate our investments is important. And in this regard, of course, we at AGRA have Regional Food Trade Coalition and other task forces on food and nutrition security, as well as the logistics task force that are beginning to play this coordinating role and sharing much of information around what is happening in the continent, as well as learning lessons from each other and using those platforms to engage governments in terms of addressing issues that are important for the regional food trade to occur.
All right.
And finally, before you switch me off, I think the private sector becomes also extremely important player, whether we are talking about the generation of data and information for decision making, whether we are looking at the private sector in terms of how they can play a role in the regions or countries' strategic grain reserves is extremely important, and we should find a way of working, public sector working very, very closely with the private sector. Over to Janet.
All right, thank you, Protase, for that. I think our time is up. We may need to move to the next session, but before we do that, thank you for the insights, Protase. I would just like to ask Yusuf, maybe some of the things you think we need to do differently. I see Jacob Mwale has said a few, but Yusuf, you could, what are the long term we should do differently? But before you come in, Yusuf, I have a response from Jacob Mwale. He says 3 things we should do moving forward. He is not able to speak right now. Is improve the statistics of information on stocks within the countries and within the continent so that we share, allow free trade and avoid price peaks. Sector needs to target investment, stimulus investments, and then technology across the value chain and reduce human intervention in grain handling. So those are some of the things going forward. Yusuf, you have, as we close, do you have closing remarks and what you think we should do differently?
Repeat your question, please. You said a question was to do what? What do we do differently in future pandemics?
Yes, or even short term, right? Currently, what can we do differently?
We need more effective testing and control at the border, because currently Uganda is insisting that we pay for testing, which is costing a lot of money, and generally it's just the border, the checking systems and control systems that have at the border around COVID needs to be rethought and reworked completely. That's the main thing that's causing a lot of cost increase on our side for transporters, which end of the day ends up being passed on to the consumers.
All right.
It's mainly just efficiency. Everything else is sort of up and down as usual.
All right. Okay, thank you very much, Yusuf. Protase, any remaining remark? All right.
The issue around, of course, trade facilitation has come out very, very strongly as an important issue, and countries need to work together in terms of harmonizing these issues, either between countries or between regions, because this is one of the areas that have become extremely important for the region. Over to you.
All right. Okay. Okay, thank you very much, our panelists. Apologies, we lost Jacob Mwale. So I would like to end this session and the earlier session and to thank all the panelists. And now I hand over to Dr. Chipota to take us through the recommendations.
Okay, Janet, I will take over from here. Dr. Chipota is not with us. He's attending a meeting, so he's not able to take us through those recommendations. However, I just want to first very quickly give a housekeeping matter. And I'm saying, could the attendees, people who are attending this webinar, please use the Q&A function next to the button, the chat function, to send in your comments and questions as we continue with the next session. But you can continue to send in questions for this particular session that has just ended, because we can still continue to answer your questions, but just ensure that you reference the topic grain trade so that we channel that question to the right group. So to you, Janet, I want to thank you for your great facilitation of this session, and just to apologize that our topics are very, very exciting and interesting, and we really wish we could have taken the whole day. But you know, the technology that we are working with today doesn't allow us to speak for days on end. Yeah, so you've done a great job. Thank you very much. And you've also represented our fellow women, by the way, Janet, our fellow women in agriculture. You represented them well, and I know that the next session has quite a number of people that are working with issues of gender. Our presenters were great. They spoke to a number of issues relating to grain. They talked about maize, they talked about soybeans, wheat and rice, etc. We looked at the global perspective and the sub-Saharan perspective, looking at drawing from Southern Africa, East and West Africa mainly. We are told that despite COVID-19, grain production, grain trade is not bad at all. Grain production, not trade, but production is not bad at all in our regions. That in fact, some countries are seeing production levels not seen before in their history. We heard about South Africa. However, a number of issues still need to be addressed in order to take advantage of this good picture. Thanks to Holger, who presented the global trade impact and policy response in grain markets during COVID-19, who noted that despite COVID, the market is still well supplied globally. We are nowhere near where the implications were in 2008 during the global food crisis. Thanks to Professor Ferdi, we noted that South Africa had a good harvest in the last season, and so did a number of countries in the Southern Africa region. Some countries have surplus stock to even trade across borders, but I think the issue is around bottlenecks of getting those products across borders. Despite lockdown regulations though, grain and grain trade is flowing relatively effectively in the Southern African region. He noted that traditional bottlenecks remain the problem in the context of regional trade, including poor infrastructure. Overall, price levels are lower than they were, than they have been compared to when we had shortages. In the East Africa region, thanks to Kim Mhando, we are told that some of the issues that are a result of COVID-19 relate to issues such as disruptions at the border, delays leading to disputes between countries. Trucks are stuck at borders for too long, causing wastage of grain. But the outlook in East Africa, the future outlook, Kim is saying that we are expecting a relatively good harvest, all things being equal. We may even be better than when the COVID restrictions came into place. In West Africa, we had a great presentation from Dr. Andrew, who focused on one commodity, rice. And he said rice is an important crop in West Africa. So what can we learn from other countries that are doing well in rice production? He said for every bag of rice consumed in West Africa, half of that bag is from another part of the world. So is our issue about technology, about financial constraints? Do we have issues in terms of private sector players? What about the missing middle? Do we have issues around value addition? Those are some of the questions that came out of Dr. Andrew's presentation. And he gave recommendations on how to move forward. He actually said, if you are not doing well in rice production, you really should be thinking of another commodity. And then we had our panelists who validated the data and information that was provided by our presenters. Thank you very much to the panelists from AGRA, from our colleague Yusuf, who is a logistics person who is suffering greatly in terms of trying to get commodities across borders. But we thank you for the work that you are doing anyway. As ReNAPRI, we are looking to you together with the East Africa Grain Council to help us collect the information that we need when we are creating our stories, the stories that we present to the policymaker for his decision making. So having said that, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank once again EAGC, our partners in this webinar. I want to thank all the attendees for your great questions, and keep them coming, because research is an ongoing project. It's never ending. Every piece of information is relevant. So keep your questions coming on this topic. And just to thank, of course, our panelists once again, and our great researchers, Professor Ferdi, Holger, Dr. Andrew, and to you, Kim, for your great presentation from East Africa. So ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this first webinar for today.